shared, used the word Jesuit in relation to Ignatian spirituality, which is very appropriate because it came out of the Jesuit tradition, and in particular from St. Ignatius of Loyola. But I'm not a Jesuit. I want to make sure you know that. I'm a trained spiritual director, and I've been through a number of retreats. I've done the 19th annotation, which I'll talk a little bit more about as I get into this. But I'm not a Jesuit, so I want to make sure you know that. A little bit about my background. I've completed a certificate in spiritual direction at a place called Christos Center in Minnesota. I have a PhD in the field of counseling and psychology, and I'm currently teaching as a tennis coach. So if afterwards you want to hear about how those dots connect and you have 3 hours, we can have a conversation, all right? But so right now I mainly do, for my professional activity, tennis coaching, and then I do spiritual direction on the side. The fact is that I'd love to do more spiritual direction. It's definitely a vocational interest for me, but regardless, that's how things are situated now in my life. So I'll jump into this. So Ignatian spirituality, and I've written as a subtitle, From Bondage to Self to the True Self in Christ. And I think that's the sort of flow that is that we're all going towards in doing the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Now, I'm going to start with a poem by Teresa of Avila, or Avila, I should say. And she heard these words in prayer and made it into a poem. So I'm going to read this. Soul, you must seek yourself in me, and in yourself seek me. With such skill, soul, love could portray you in me, that a painter well gifted could never show so finely that image. For love you are fashioned deep within me, painted so beautiful, so fair. If my beloved you are lost, soul, seek yourself in me. So a beautiful prayer in which Teresa heard God speaking to her in prayer. Now, let's see here. Where do I want to start with my introductory comments? I've already said some things. This is important to me today. During the service today, Mother Stacy shared how helpful spiritual direction had been to her in her life, and in particular, working the spiritual exercises. And that's the part that I really want to focus on today, is how helpful spiritual direction can be to people, and in particular the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And that's most of what my comments and my discussion is coming out of today, is my own personal experience with how helpful Ignatian spirituality has been for me in a very practical way, and then doing or being a part of that through spiritual exercises. And I'll talk more about what that phrase or term spiritual exercises means. Just a little example here to get started. Like I said, I'm a tennis coach, and this past week I was warming up with one of my clients, and when you warm up in tennis, you usually stand about halfway into the court, closer to the net, and you hit kind of softly back and forth. And it was one of these times where I noticed myself just kind of getting into this zone where I felt like I was in a flow. And I don't know if any of you are into athletics or exercising, but at some point it didn't really feel like there was a separation between me and the sensual field that I was a part of. So I knew my body was moving, but I wasn't really focusing on any one particular thing. And there's a feeling that goes along with that. You know, the athletes will sometimes call that being in the zone, where in basketball you can't miss for some reason. You're just kind of a part of the sensual field around you. And you learn what that feels like, but before that can happen, you have to do tons of practicing. You have to reflect on your movements and how to become proficient in a sport like tennis. And so it takes a while before you can get to the point where you can even get into that space of feeling like you're in the zone or in the flow. It's similar then with our spirituality and doing spiritual exercises. Ignatius made the comment that since we need to take care of our physical selves by physically exercising, we also need to take care of ourselves through spiritual exercises. And we can learn to distinguish between those times when we're in that zone, so to speak, and we're to some extent in union with God, and times when we're not. And one of the it's the genius, in my opinion, of St. Ignatius, is that he really looked at that closely and learned how to do practical things to get into that space with God. So, I'm going to move on here. So, I've already covered this. Ignatian, of course, refers to, when we talk about Ignatian spirituality, of course, we're referring to St. Ignatius of Loyola, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history of St. Ignatius in a little bit. Here's the formal purpose that Ignatius states in his book, or it's actually not a book. I'm going to share right now up front that if you were to look at this book and its content, you'd see that it's just an endless series of annotations, all right? So it's not narrative, and it's really not interesting at all. And so I remember early in my process of learning about Ignatian spirituality that it had some connection to another group that I was a part of. And I thought, wow, I'm interested in this. And so I went out and got this book, and lists of annotations one after another, just notes one after another, that until you learn more about it, you don't know what the connection is. It's hard to know what it's all about. So anyway, within this book, which you probably wouldn't want to read the first time you were exposed to it and picked it up, he shares that about the purpose for the spiritual exercises. So spiritual exercises, which have as their purpose the conquest of self and the regulation of one's life in such a way that no decision is made under the influence of this is an important word, inordinate attachment. All right? So, keep in mind that this wording was developed in the 1500s. So it's pretty austere and formal, and not that welcoming. But you're going to see how this description here is the basis for getting us to a place of union with God. So anyway, spiritual exercises which have as their purpose the conquest of self and the regulation of one's life in such a way that no decision, that's an important word, decision, because Ignatian spirituality is very much tied to not only that word inordinate attachments and becoming aware of that and how they influence our lives, but also then decisions about our lives. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so as I was preparing my presentation, in one of my daily meditations I do as a part of my daily Bible study, I came across this from 2 Corinthians. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Once again, that idea that I was talking about earlier about Tennyson, being in the zone, and about how in spirituality we can get into sort of a zone with God. And so here, the Apostle Paul is talking about that place of freedom that we can get into with the Spirit and in our relationship with God. Well, so I think this is where Ignatius wants to get us to, where he's trying to bring us to. But once again, at first it's not that obvious, and there's a lot of information, a lot more information that needs to be understood in order to understand how he wants to take us there in a very practical way. Okay, so most people, the casual observer who really doesn't know much about Ignatian spirituality may know that a central part of Ignatian spirituality are retreats. And I've listed the different types of retreats that are offered through Ignatian spirituality. And the 20th annotation, which is a 28-day or 30-day experience that's conducted away from your normal life and in silence, and with intensive spiritual direction, is typically and is for sure one of the paths that the Jesuits in training will follow, and they'll complete that several times during the course of their long training. For most of us, it's not practical to take 30 days outside of our normal life and engage in an intensive retreat. And so St. Ignatius also developed the 19th annotation, which is a form that I've completed and I've taken other people through, which is the same content but within your daily life over a 9-month period. And so once again, it's the same content that takes place that would take place in that 30-day apart from the world retreat, but it's during your everyday life. So typically you'll set aside at least 30 to 45 minutes per day for personal prayer, in addition to readings and then meeting with a spiritual director. And then the last one that's listed there, the 18th annotation, that's typically, that would include something like this, where you're learning bits and pieces about the spiritual exercises as an introduction to getting you probably further into another form of the exercises, but it's not the entire experience of the spiritual exercises. It's a part of or pieces of the spiritual exercises, and often takes place in the form of maybe a series of weekly meetings or a series of weekend meetings. But once again, it's not as intensive and does not cover the entirety of the spiritual exercises as the 20th and 19th do. Now, something it's helpful to point out, when you pick up the what's really a manual or a handbook for the spiritual exercises, and you look at all these annotations and the wording, you might think that it's a very rigid program that, once again, is very austere and that isn't very adaptable. But in fact, the truth is just the opposite. As evidenced by these different forms that the spiritual exercises are given, Ignatius emphasized adaptability to a high degree. And so this is straight from, once again, the spiritual exercises, and this is annotation 22, to assure better cooperation between the one who is giving the exercises and the exercitant, and more beneficial results for both. It is necessary to suppose that every good Christian is more ready to put a good interpretation on another statement than to condemn it as false. If an orthodox construction cannot be put on a proposition, the one who made it should be asked how he understands it. If he is in error, he should be corrected with all kindness, If this does not suffice, all appropriate means should be used to bring him to a correct interpretation and so defend the proposition from error. And so once again, formal language, but the bottom line there is that Ignatian spirituality is very adaptable, and Ignatius himself was quick to emphasize that we should give people the benefit of the doubt. And partly as a result of that, Ignatian spirituality has been adapted and applied in many contexts other than just the Roman Catholic setting, and also other than just the Jesuit setting. So it's very adaptable and has been used, as is evidenced here, and also in my life with groups other than people who were raised in the Roman Catholic tradition. Okay, so in terms of this is the breakdown now of the spiritual exercises in terms of the content of that original 30-day experience, and then also of the 19th annotation that I was just discussing. And so initially, as the retreat is getting started, there'll be a series of weeks where you're preparing to do the exercises, and where there's an emphasis on God's love for us and for all of God's creation. And part of this is, in my opinion, is because in the first week, the first formal week of the exercises, you're diving into the reality of human limitation and sin. And so that can be pretty harsh to just jump into from the start. And so there's a period of time before that where there's really an emphasis on God's loving us and God creating us out of love. But then that first week, once again, it does go into the reality of human limitation and sin. The second week of the experience is very much focused on the life of Jesus Christ through the Gospels. And so I'll be talking more about this as I go on, but one of the primary ways in which that happens, and what Ignatius was so accomplished with and good at, was imagining scenes of the actual gospel, and then placing yourself in the scene as though you were there with Jesus at the time. And I'll talk more about that, but I'm going to say this now in the event that I might forget. The experience of the exercises, and as a result of doing things like entering into the scenes themselves and imagining those scenes through prayer, results in an actual sort of firsthand experience of the gospel in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I think for me, this is the real power of the spiritual exercises, is that you have a firsthand experience through the gospel stories and the scenes of the experience of Jesus and the gospel itself. And so I recall when I first moved to New York City, I was talking with somebody who was involved with Ignatian spirituality, and I'd said, for me, the spiritual exercises is the experience of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the firsthand experience of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And she wasn't quite sure what I meant by that, because like I say, if you are looking at it just in terms of all these annotations within a book, it may not come across that way. But that's my experience in terms of, once again, it's an experiential group of exercises. It's not something where you're just reading and thinking about and talking about the issues. You're actually put in a situation where you're experiencing it through the exercises. And that, to me, is what the real power of the spiritual exercises is. And just on a personal note, having gone through the spiritual exercises myself through these, before I did the 19th annotation, which is that 9-month experience, I had been to a number of weekend retreats where they would cover the full span of the spiritual exercises. A Jesuit priest would, through 3 days of silence in a retreat setting, would cover, systematically go through the exercises through these 20-minute conferences, they called them. And I would sit there and listen and soak it up. And as a result of that, I felt like I experienced the gospel in a way that I'd never experienced it before. And, in waking up in the morning at times would spontaneously be saying to myself, thank you, Jesus, for saving me in a way that I'd never experienced before. So once again, what was so powerful for me about that was actually being in the gospel experience through the spiritual exercises in a way that I'd never been before. So anyway, that's the second week where you're really getting into the gospel experience and the life of Jesus, his earthly life. The third week is devoted to the passion and death of Jesus. And then the fourth week is devoted to the resurrection of Christ Jesus and eternal life through the body of Christ. So, there isn't a lot of information in the spiritual exercises or time that's devoted to the Old Testament. There's enough of it that you kind of know where you're starting from, but then it's pretty much exclusively focused on Jesus and the Gospels. So non-attachment and the first principle and foundation. So another sort of hallmark of Ignatian spirituality, and I'm going to focus on this part of the slide, that middle portion. In everyday life, then, we must hold this is Ignatius in the spiritual exercises now writing this. In everyday life, then, we must hold ourselves in balance before all created gifts, insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some responsibility. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one, for everything has the potential of calling forth in us a more loving response to our life forever with God. So, there's once again an emphasis on non-attachment, and sometimes it's referred to as indifference within Ignatian spirituality. In that sense, there is some similarity with Buddhism. That emphasis on non-attachment is similar, and So anyway, that's then of course directly related to that idea of inordinate attachments and learning how to experience some release from our inordinate attachments. So here we go, inordinate attachments. Let's see, where do I want to start with this? Most of us don't start at this place of freedom from inordinate attachments. That last slide where I was describing or reading how Ignatius describes the need to be non-attached. Most of us do not start from that place of non-attachment, obviously, for a variety of reasons. By the time we realize, I can only speak for myself, by the time we realize that we have significant inordinate attachments, we're well into our adult years, and it's usually the result of having experienced problems and suffering. Yes, and then I wrote, in fact, we often have difficulty discerning the inordinate from the proportionate, healthy, affirming, and loving. There can be a variety of internal influences vying for allegiance at the same time. And so this is a big emphasis or a central emphasis of the spiritual exercises and Ignatian spirituality is learning how to differentiate the difference between those two between different currents within us. So which of the interior influences do we listen to and put into action, and which do we decide to not listen to and not put into action in our interior life in terms of what we're experiencing? I'm just going to give an example of this. When I was invited to do this presentation by Mother Stacy, my initial response was an interior experience of fear and some dread and a variety of really dark emotions. And I know for me, part of that goes back to my adolescent experience and some negative experiences I had with social situations, in particular public speaking. And so initially, those interior feelings were really strong within me. And sort of at a knee-jerk way, I wanted to say no pretty quickly. That's what those feelings within me would have had me do. Those were strong feelings within me. However, I knew that I needed to wait that out because I'm aware enough of myself now that I wasn't just going to quickly react. So I gave it some time. I slept on it. And then by the time the next day started to roll around in the morning, I was starting to feel like I really wanted to do it, and I was experiencing some hope and some inspiration in the idea of being able to do it, and in terms of how it fits with my vocation in life. But both of those currents within me were strong. It eventually got to the point where I was worried that I wouldn't have the opportunity to do it, and I really needed to say yes, and I did. But that's just an example of how we can all have those conflicting currents within us, and it's sometimes difficult to know which of the interior movements that we're experiencing within us to listen to. Just a show of hands, has anybody in this room ever experienced those sort of conflicting emotions where you're not sure how to proceed or not about something? All right, I just wanted to make sure it's sometimes hard to know when you're just speaking and you haven't asked for any interaction yet, so good, I'm glad. I'm not glad that you've experienced conflict, but I'm glad that I'm not alone and I'm not crazy. So hold on a second. And then in addition to that then, it's not just us. Ignatius of Loyola, the human being, was very much this way himself, just like the rest of us. Let's see here what I want to say. So I'll just share a little bit about the history of Ignatius of Loyola. He was born in 1491, and I'll show you a map in a second. And this up in the northeast portion of Spain, close to France. Born into a family of mid-level nobility. He had some definite hardship as he was growing up. His mother died when he was 7, and was raised for a time by the wife of the family blacksmith. Moving on. So anyway, I just wanted to show those of you who've been to Spain, if you've ever, this is the north of Spain up here, France is up here. So he was from an area way up there's San Sebastian, so like way up in here. He was from up there in Basque country in Spain. I'm sure many of you here have been to Spain. But definitely, in terms of his cultural constraints, Ignatius he never, from what I've read, considered being anything other than Christian. So it's important to acknowledge that. Even though Ignatian approach is very adaptable. He never considered, from what I know, being anything other than Christian. His family is described as outwardly pious, but behind the scenes, very much involved in non-pious behavior. Let's put it that way. That's the best way to describe it for today. I'm going to read this word for word because this is good. So he grew up in that northeastern area of Spain, and then at 15, I'll read this. At age 15, Ignatius is sent 400 miles from his birthplace to his father's friend, Juan Velasquez, chief treasurer of King Ferdinand, to be educated as a Christian gentleman. There, Ignatius learns to ride, fence, dance, and sing. He reads novels of chivalry, the popular literature of the Spanish Renaissance. Though he has received tonsure, Ignatius dresses fashionably in bright colors and a flowing cape with a feather in his cap and sword and a dagger at his waist. He leads a worldly life centered on pleasure, ambition, and vainglory. He is passionate about gambling, flirtatious with women, and quick with his sword. So, in some ways, he was like every other 15-year-old that's ever lived, right? And then, but definitely you can see that he had plenty of opportunity to develop inordinate attachments, right? So just like us. So that's a picture of Ignatius in his younger years. That's obvious. I don't think that was actually ever, I don't think that's an actual photo or picture that was painted at the time, but I'm not sure. So anyway, raised in this mid-level family of nobility, sent away to be trained in becoming a Spanish gentleman, very much in the process of developing his own inordinate attachments. So at 30 years old, this one's titled "At 30 Years Old and at a Crossroads." So at some point then, the chief treasurer to King Ferdinand, who was a friend of Ignatius's father, was dismissed because of a change in power. And so Ignatius had been working for Juan Velasquez as a page in the service to the crown, so an attendant doing all sorts of things that needed to be done. And when this chief treasurer was dismissed, then Ignatius no longer had a role there, and so he moved back to where he was from in the area of Loyola, and he became a soldier, Spanish gentleman, and knight in service to the crown in that area. And this is like the turning point then in Ignatius's life. In 1521 in Pamplona, which is up in that same area in Basque country, they were defending the city of Pamplona, and with Spanish forces badly outnumbered, Ignatius took up a defense of the town fortress as a matter of honor. Ignatius' leg was shattered when it was struck by a cannonball. 3 excruciating surgeries later, Ignatius found himself recovering in bed and at his home castle in Loyola. His life was at a crossroads. So, I think we all reach crossroads in our life. This was a crossroads for Ignatius because due to his injury, he wasn't going to be able to lead the life that he had been living before. And so he was convalescing now at his home in Loyola, in the home castle, and he had asked for these tales of chivalry that he would be able to read while he recuperated. or while he recovered. And they didn't have any of these to give to him, so he was given a life of Christ and a book about the lives of the saints. And while he recovered, he began to imagine, on the one hand, the life that he had wanted to live as a knight, sort of late Middle Ages knight in Spain, and the things that would go along with that. And he began to imagine the life of a saint and the things that the saints that had lived, and what it would be like for him if he engaged in that sort of a life. And what he noticed within him was these contrasting interior movements once again. On the one hand, both of these paths led him to feel inspired and resulted in positive interior feelings. However, the old path to knighthood, as he let it sit longer and longer within him, it became dry and heavy, and he experienced some, let's just say, a form of kind of depression in association with that line of thought and imagination. And when he thought about emulating the lives of the saints, he had positive feelings, positive interior feelings that built and became stronger and lasted. And so on the basis of this, at some point, he was very, what's the word I'm looking for, introspective in noticing what was going on within him. And out of this then, he made a decision that he would give up his old life. And his initial plan was to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But he didn't really have a plan about what he was going to do with his new life of emulating the saints. It was mainly just that he was going to live that new Christian life, and that he was going to emulate the saints, and that he was going to go to Jerusalem. And so I just covered this until one time his eyes were opened a little, that he saw something different. So I just want to ensure that I don't want to miss some of this important information about Ignatian types of prayer. So as a result of experiences like this and careful note-taking, as I described, he's got a whole book of annotations. He developed a number of specific types of prayer. Meditation for him was really reflecting deeply, cognitively about, for example, cognitive scenes and the meaning of that and how it affected him internally. He then also developed a form of prayer called imaginative prayer, and this is very unique to Ignatian spirituality, where you put yourself in a gospel scene, for example, mentally, and you imagine that and see how that affects you. And there's a variety of ways to experience that. There are times where people who engage in imaginative prayer will, for example, there will be characters in the scene who will be saying things to them in their prayer experience. Some people aren't comfortable with that, others are, and not all people experience it the same way. But the imaginative prayer is putting yourself in the situation, in the gospel scene. And then third, the colloquy, which is just a casual, sort of informal conversation with God, where you're talking to God in prayer. And then, some other key contributions that are central to Ignatian spirituality are the terms consolation and desolation, which is what I described about my experience in deciding to do this presentation. It's what Ignatius experienced when he was deciding on whether he would pursue his old life or this new life. But he paid very close attention then to what was going on inside of him. And then, this is the key though, this is the key, is that he had the faith to follow the interior movements that lasted and that he experienced as coming from God. And so they weren't just, for him, different emotional currents. For him, they were actual ways to discern which decisions to make and which path to follow in his Christian life. And I think, yeah, and so that's not unique, but what's unique is how he very clearly developed descriptions of those experiences, and then eventually rules to pay attention to as you have these experiences that can be guides for us in our spiritual journey. So I'm gonna just give one example of this. I know we're gonna be out of time pretty quick. So within this, within his handbook, in the back, there are 2 sets of rules for the discernment of spirits. One, he intends more for people who are early in the exercises and are just sort of spiritual novices and are still sorting out the bigger chunks. And then there's another set for people who have learned more about their interior movements, their interior spiritual movements, and are able to deal with things that are more subtle. So this is an example that can be really helpful, and has been really helpful for me. It's just a simple thing that's very practical, but how many of us, I don't think, how many of us really pay attention to the point where we establish definite rules about some of these things that are going on in us, and then follow those rules based on faith to our betterment and the betterment of others. I think that's pretty rare, and that's what's, to me, the genius of St. Ignatius. So anyway, this is one rule within the first set of rules, the rules for the first week or early in the exercises. During a time of desolation, one should never make a change. Instead, one should remain firm and constant in the resolutions and in the decision which one had the day before the desolation, or a decision in which one was during a previous time of consolation. For just as the good spirit is chiefly the one who guides and counsels us in time of consolation, so it is the evil spirit who does this in time of desolation. By following his counsels, we can never find the way to a right decision. So, in my experience with making the decision to be a part of this presentation, I could have followed that experience of desolation, and I think my life would have been worse off. But as a result of waiting and observing and taking more time, I was able to experience the consolation that was a better guide for me, and that I could make a decision to follow. That's a simple example, but once again, some of you may be familiar, or maybe some of you maybe even work in the psychology field. And one of the principles within the psychology field for helping people in crisis is that people who are in crisis should not be encouraged to make big life decisions, right, until they've reached a point of stability again. So help the person return to their former level of functioning, and then you can, and on a more healthy level of functioning, and then you can start to consider changes. This is similar, but at a spiritual level. So if you're experiencing desolation, it's usually not a good time to follow that current or make a decision based on that current, because it'll probably lead you in a less loving direction that's going to take you away from, or lead you away from God. So we're just about out of time. So I'm gonna wrap this up with just some quick comments about where Ignatius went from here. He ended up traveling to the area around Barcelona, and he was a spiritual novice at this point for sure, and he ended up spending a great deal of time in a cave, wanting to kind of emulate the saints that had gone before him, and made a lot of mistakes. But he received help from the abbey at Montserrat, where there are Benedictine monks, and he was able to learn from his experience, and then, once again, set up guidelines for people on how to handle some of the things that he went through. So I don't have time to get through all this right now. That's him in Manresa. So I want to share this. This is really important to Ignatian spirituality, is the examen prayer, and the importance of review in Ignatian spirituality. So one of the things he learned during this time when he was making all these mistakes is that it's important not to get too caught up in any one experience within your prayer life, that you need to learn to reflect and examine over the course of time. And one of the ways that he established that's helpful for us to, that's a helpful way for us to do this is through the examen prayer. And many people learn to do this on a daily basis, most often in the evening, but you can see the basic components there: to pray for God's help and presence in the prayer experience, to give thanks for the gifts of the day, pray over the significant interior movements that surface as you replay the day, rejoice and seek forgiveness based on what you've reviewed, and then look to tomorrow and ask for help. So the point I'm emphasizing here is that Ignatius really emphasized the review of your spiritual experience, and then to carefully discern what's changing and happening over the course of time with practical techniques like the examen. Okay. So, I just want to conclude by saying that Ignatian spirituality is in my estimation, a very practical approach to spirituality, it's almost modern in the sense that it's very introspective. It's almost scientific in the sense that Ignatius was such an insightful observer, and then would set up rules and guidelines for helping people. So it's very unique, and I think that uniqueness is really captured by that description of the Jesuits and and Ignatian spirituality as an example of contemplatives in action. So prior to Saint Ignatius's time, most of the religious orders were in cloistered environments where people were away from the world. For example, and this is a good thing too. But it was like the Benedictines, the Franciscans. These are very positive and helpful approaches to Christian spirituality as well. But Ignatius was very unique in that he helped to establish an order that never cloistered and never separated itself from the world. And so this is why they're called contemplatives in action, because they were and Ignatius himself was very contemplative. He was very introspective, but he emphasized then making decisions about that and being very active in the world based on that interior contemplation. I'm gonna just conclude by reading this prayer that's attributed to Saint Ignatius. That's a prayer of offering. So, Take, Lord, and the word susthepe means receive. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all that I have and call my own. You have given it all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. So, thank you for being here today. I appreciate your attendance. Like I say, my primary goal for today is pastoral, in that I hope that some of you can see something in this that could be valuable to you in your walk with God, and especially that could inspire you to get involved in spiritual direction. And perhaps if Ignatian spirituality is the right approach for you, that you could at some point complete or be a part of some form of spiritual exercises, whether that's the 18th, the 19th, or even the 20th. So does anybody have any comments or questions? Go ahead. No. No, like I said up front, I'm not a Jesuit. I've been trained as a spiritual director, and I've been a part of Ignatian spirituality for retreats and then additional training at a Catholic church here in the city. But I've been involved in Ignatian spirituality for going back to about, let's see here, it was at about 2007. Yeah.
My other question is historical.
Yeah.
Because of his retreat,
Yeah.
did he make it to Jerusalem?
Now, what happened is he had incredible willpower. He had incredible energy and willpower, and despite his injury, it did heal. He walked with a limp, but he was able to make it to Jerusalem. But he was, and this was another learning experience for him. He was basically told by the Franciscans, who were the order in that area, the Catholic order in that area, that he had to leave because it was too dangerous. And so, because of the conflicts in the area at that time. And so he had set a lot of his hopes on going to Jerusalem, and he thought he was going to convert people who were non-Christians there. And that didn't work out for him. He went back to Barcelona, where he had departed from to begin with. And, he learned from that as well. He learned that when you're in a period of intense spiritual consolation, and that is very genuine, recognize that the time afterwards is not necessarily a part of that experience. So one of his rules as a result was, be careful to examine the time afterwards and ensure that the decisions that are made are actually a part of the consolation. Because this is kind of me interpreting his history, but I think he had concluded that it was his calling, in some sense, to go to Jerusalem. And he got there and was kicked out, essentially. And then, so what does this mean? I thought this was my calling, in some sense, from God, to go to Jerusalem. So he learned from that. His faith was maintained, but he learned, once again, he was very insightful and established rules and said, if you're having these intense experiences, don't conclude for sure that the decisions you make in the following time period are a part of that intense consolation. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. Any other questions? Tristan, can you bump up handheld too, please?
Hey, I just had a question about one of my spiritual practices, and
Yeah.
it kind of sounds Ignatian, and I was just
Yeah.
curious if you could tell me
Yeah.
if that's in the style.
Right.
So one of the things I will do is I'll meditate on the Lord's Prayer,
Yeah.
and I'll kind of go line by line.
Yeah.
And obviously the first statement is Our Father, which there's
Yeah.
so much in that. But one of the things I read once was that you could do, this is something I've incorporated in my life, is the phrase Our Father by Jesus
Yeah.
indicates not that it's just all of ours as the church, but it's his as well. And so I will actually sometimes imagine like kneeling with Jesus next to me as we say that line together.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me
Yes.
of that. So is that kind of what he talks about when he's
Yes.
saying, like visualizing yourself as part
Absolutely.
of the
Yeah,
gospel?
that's very much like what he taught people to do in terms of, he called it contemplative prayer.
Mm-hmm.
But that's confusing because contemplative prayer tends to be associated with prayer where you don't think thoughts
Yeah.
and you don't have imagery. And so that's why it ended up being called imaginative prayer. But that's very much, and I would say exactly what he taught. Yeah, is putting yourself in the scene and then seeing how God affects you in that while you're in the scene and experiencing it. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Let's see.
There was a couple people here, and I'm going to share one thing about that real quick while the microphone's going around. I want to share one thing. So regarding imaginative prayer, what you were just talking about, not everybody experiences that the same way, and sometimes people feel like, oh, I have to experience it the way it's described by, Ignatius or somebody who easily adapts to this type of prayer. But O'Brien, in his book, The Ignatian Adventure, points out that some people find imaginative prayer difficult. They may not be able to picture the scene easily, yet they may have some intuition or gut reaction to the story, or they may hear or feel the story more than visualize it. In a spirit of generosity, pray as you are able. Don't try to force it. Rest assured that God will speak to you, whether through your memory, understanding, intellect, emotions, or imagination. So some people really easily relate to the suggestion that that there may be times when a character within that scene will speak to you. I'm not one of those people. For me, it's more about some deep meaning or some feeling, and that's, I think, dependent partly on temperaments. Ignatius was, I don't know if any of you are MBTI aficionados, Myers-Briggs type indicator. I'm really into that, and people have said that he probably was an ESTJ, which that type of personality would be very well suited to imagining sensual scenes and thinking about them. I, as an INFJ, I'm more of an intuitor, and so that doesn't come as easily for me, and it doesn't need to come at all. I can still imagine the scene and just see what happens within that scene and how that affects me and how God affects me in that. So I'm sorry, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much for this. I was struck a few slides back about the Ignatius, I guess, application of indifference. I assume
Yes.
it doesn't mean
Yes.
apathy like we use it, but
No,
maybe a sense
no.
of neutrality or...
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. He doesn't mean that you don't care. What he means is that your center, this is the way I understand it, he means that your center is in your relationship with God. And so you make choices based on what's going to nourish that relationship with God. So it's not about choosing one thing or another. It's about, how do I experience this in terms of my relationship with God and what's best for my loving relationship with God and others. Does that make sense? So it's not. I like to use the word non-attachment because it's easier to understand than indifference, I think. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. When I was on retreat at SSJE last month, I made the mistake of reading that dry tome of
Oh,
Saint-
yes.
Yeah, I read it. What threw me was in the first week of the retreat,
Yeah.
and the whole thing on sin, you'll remember
Yeah.
it. Sin,
Yeah.
and the in the instruction to start examining your sin since you were a conscious kid.
Yeah.
That one just made me, well, I did read the whole thing, but the whole idea of going back to childhood and looking at sin just struck me as, well, so Renaissance, but still
Yeah.
so wrong
Right.
for our times.
Right.
I'm wondering how you would translate that to our times.
Yeah, I think for me, we all. I mean, I had the same reaction, even in it's just in effect a translation of the spiritual exercises that O'Brien has that I went through myself. It was a little bit harsh at times for me, to deal with just how that intensive focus on my sin, And so, and even for me, I grew up and I'm still a practicing ELCA Lutheran, but within the Lutheran Church we talk about we're sinner saints, and I like to switch it around sometimes and say saintly sinners. And so there's that understanding that we're both loved by God but limited at the same time, that we're in some sense broken, but it's more about God's love for us than our brokenness, that's the ultimate definition. And so for me, part of that is there's some subtle theological differences that I need to give myself the freedom to say, I need to look at it this way, as I'm going. And that's that issue of adaptability with the exercises that I think is there. And I don't, in my experience, people today, my experience of most Jesuits today that I've met, and then spiritual directors is in going through the exercises, that you're not going to have your feet held to the fire in terms of you have to look at it a particular way. So for me, it was more about, I'm a mark misser. I do that a lot, and I'm trying to do better in my life, but I am limited, and I'm sinful too. But it's not about me being a bad person. It's not about me being bad or shameful. It's about the fact that I'm human. I'm never going to be perfect, and I am going to do bad things at times. But still, the emphasis has to be more on God's love for me, and that's the central defining point, or central definition of who I am is that I'm loved by God more than that I'm broken. So does that help at all?
It does.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I
was
think
just curious if you
but I
reacted
think
to that.
I don't think there's any one right answer to that. I think that everybody has to find sort of their balancing point with that. And I think part of it is, the time in which this was written. It was 1500s Spain, So that affected how it was presented and how it was thought about, So.
This is a good segue, I think.
Yeah.
Third slide, I believe, is what it was, and you were, there were 3 sections. The final section says, do whatever is appropriate to make them understand. Something to that effect. My question is, given when this man lived, that sounds very painful to me. What is very appropriate?
Okay, I think I remember. I know what you're
There,
talking
I
about.
think you
Here,
just went by.
this one right here.
Back one.
Yeah.
Pardon me? I can't read it. My
Okay,
glasses are
so
not working.
Yeah, so once again, yes, it says, if this does not suffice, all appropriate means should be used to bring him to a correct interpretation, and so defend the proposition from error, right?
What does that actually mean? Because in his day, that meant torture.
Well, from what I understand, I've never heard that he was interested in in applying that sort of an outcome. So I don't think he would have ever advocated that. In fact, I don't. He seemed to definitely not be somebody who would do that. From what I've read, that's not to say that some of the people in ruling positions around him might not have done that. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I don't think I know the history well enough to answer that question.
Well, I guess my question
Yeah.
really is today. What does that mean?
Today,
All appropriate. What would you do to get somebody onto the path that you want them?
well, I think that would be the problem. Is for me as a spiritual director, I would not seek to get them on the path that I want them on. I mean that would be totally outside of my experience of God, and so I would. It depends on the issue, It depends on what particular content we'd be focusing on, or what the issue is that we'd be focusing on. But in terms of, I don't believe in violating anyone's basic sense of autonomy, or their right to be who they are. So that once again has to do with, I think, historical times, but also I'm not aware of spiritual directors myself that would be trying to force someone onto a particular path. Does that help at all, or a little? Yeah, I've known spiritual directors and people who work spiritual exercises in a variety of contexts, and over at the Church of St. Francis Xavier, for example, over on about 16th Street, I think, over here in Manhattan, I never experienced people taking a hardline approach in any way either. That it was very compassionate and loving, whatever the issue was. But I don't doubt that there were people in the past that have, in fact, we know for sure there have been people who've done very awful things within the Jesuit tradition, within any number of Christian traditions. Same thing with my tradition. Luther's words were used to persecute and kill Jewish people. And I don't know if he would have wanted that to happen directly, but he said things that resulted in Jewish people being killed. And so, yeah, that's certainly something that is important to be aware of, and there have been times when words like this have been used to treat people in very awful ways, obviously. So. And just, I want to say one other thing too. There's some really good translations of this that change the wording in ways that make it less harsh. And so there's a book by, I'll go to the end here real quick. I just want to make sure you're aware of this because that's an important topic. I want to go down to the bibliography, and this book right here, for example, Draw Me Into Your Friendship, the Spiritual Exercise, is a literal translation. So it has the literal and then right next to it a contemporary reading. So there are numerous contemporary translations that will change they don't. I don't know that they change the meaning, but they reinterpret it in a way that, or express it in a way that's, I guess I would just say more loving, or more easy for us to apply in our lives today in a compassionate way.
Is there some sort of normal progression in following and learning about Ignatian? Like, would somebody jump right in and do like the 19th or the?
No, I think I'll just give you an example of my life, and this will help. And how this happened for me. I was attending. It was kind of like back in the '90s. They had these. They were like house church. There was a house church movement and the garage churches and all that sort of thing. Anyway, I was involved in one of these churches, and one of the fellow members of the church invited me to a weekend retreat at a nearby Jesuit retreat center. And so that was an amazing experience for me in terms of like in the silence going through the spiritual exercises in a 3-day period, and how it just like this part of me came alive that wasn't alive before or I wasn't aware of. And then every year there was that same part of me that was kind of tracking my development as I would go back, each year to this silent retreat on the same weekend. So that was the start for me. And then I got into spiritual direction myself. I then went through 18th annotation experiences, these little sort of educational experiences that were on like a weekly basis. And then from there, I did the 19th over at the Church of St. Francis Xavier. Then I started to take people through the 19th myself. And so that's how it progressed for me. And so I think usually it starts with some kind of a retreat experience, something within a church setting where they're doing these 18th annotation experiences, and then you decide, I like this. I think I'm going to try a little more of this. And the 19th is more than a little more. It's 9 months. It's pretty intensive. But I think that's kind of how it progresses, because it really, and that's the point of this whole thing, is that it's helpful. It's brought me closer to God. I have more clarity in my internal life. And so it's helped me. It's made my life better, So anyway, I saw somebody else with their hand up.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Robert. Consolation and desolation.
Yeah.
I've been sitting here trying to process that.
Yeah.
Because on one level, consolation, of course, is experiencing the love of God, which covers a multitude of sins.
Yes. Yeah.
The desolation
Yeah.
translates for me that I've really messed up the circumstances of my life, and I'm left to the consequences of that, no matter what I experience in terms of the consolation, which is not understanding consolation completely. So where I just went with it was making decisions out of consolation, which is making decisions out of love, and making decisions out of desolation is making a decision out of fear.
That's one example. Yeah, fear would be one example of desolation. Yeah.
Right, and that the scripture verse, if we love casts out fear, and if we have fear, we have not love, which was always an either or for me until I realized, no, I have love. If I experience fear, it's not that I don't have the love.
Yeah.
It's that I'm not experiencing it, because what has moved in is the fear of punishment, because that's really where it ultimately goes. It's taken me 40 years to learn that.
Yeah, and that's one example. That's a very good example that you've connected the fear to punishment, and yeah.
So what happens is, although I have this amazing relationship with God, and I know that God loves me beyond,
Yeah.
still I must live in this realm of this physical limitation of my own decision-making.
Yeah.
And it's not just circumstances outside of me that
No,
limit
right,
me.
right.
My own decision-making is
Right.
limited. So I have fear of punishment from bad decisions, if you know what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah.
So it's like Francis Schaeffer said, or one of his quotes that I remember, and I'll probably misquote it, is, "How then shall we live?" I have this revelation of God's love for me, this experience with God through Jesus Christ. I get it. It's amazing. I'm living the gospel.
Right.
Yet, how do I apply that to my life? But I have to be careful so that things go right. And I think that's where I get caught up. I want things to go right, and then that proves the existence of God, or it proves my relationship with God is good. But I'm crucified by the circumstances of my life. And it's only the promise of resurrection through them, like every day, this is the day God has made, all things in it God has allowed. If there's nothing created that wasn't created by Jesus, when we go back to what it says in John.
Sure.
So it's a conundrum, I guess. But I really want to thank you for giving me that opportunity to kind of mull that over,
Sure.
Consolation and Desolation.
Sure. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap? All right, please join me in giving Kevin a warm round of applause. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us.
I didn't leave any of my contact information. I forgot about that. But if anybody has any follow-up questions in relation to spiritual direction or just Ignatian spirituality, I'm always willing to answer those questions. I think Father Bo should have my phone number and email if somebody wanted to contact me about follow-up questions or spiritual direction or Ignatian spirituality. So thank you. I
Thank you
appreciate
again.
you guys being here. Thank you so much.